So yeah, so thanks everybody for being here for our special event. So some people haven't heard, but today is a very auspicious day, not only because we have Gloria Dickie with us today, yay. But can somebody reiterate why it's fantastic, especially fantastic that Gloria is with us today?
It's World
Marcia,
War Day.
it's World Bear Day. Happy World Bear Day, everybody. Marcia, would you be comfortable reiterating what World Bear Day is, or does somebody else want to say what World Bear Day is?
Well, World Bear Day celebrates all the different bears across the world. You know, they have a grizzly bear day and a polar bear day and black bear day kind of thing. But if you Google it and read it, the paragraph description is like reading the chapter headings of Miss Dickey's book. It's, you know, the sun bear and the spectacled bear, and you know, it includes all the bears that don't seem to have their own day. So it's a day to celebrate all bears and to think about how we can protect them on this earth.
Thank you. Thanks, Marcia, and thanks everybody for celebrating World Bear Day with the Fat Bear Book Club and with Gloria Dickie. Very glad to have you with us. Gloria is in London, so quite a bit of time ahead of us. So we're going to try to keep this maybe to an hour and 10 minutes or so. We'll see how it goes. Just a reminder, I think everybody's been to at least one meeting before. You're welcome to show your smiling faces or not, whatever you're comfortable with. We do ask you to keep yourself on mute unless you're actually speaking, just because it's a large group and it can get loud. And if you need to step away to go feed the cat or feed a child or feed yourself or whatever, that's totally fine. Feel free to come and go as you see fit. We are recording. Yes, we are recording. And so I'll post this and send it out, after today. So we'll follow our usual format. I will ask some friendly icebreaker questions so you can all see how nice Gloria is. And then we'll open it up after a few minutes to questions from the group. So I hope you all have great questions. But let's start with the easy ones. Gloria, thank you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Very
Yeah.
happy to see so many bear enthusiasts here tonight.
You've come to the right place if you're looking for bear enthusiasts. We are loving your book. So I should say that I think that different people are at different stages with this book, right? Some people have read all of it. As a group, we're up to chapter 7. Some people might not have read much at all, which is totally fine. And tell us, if you can, remind us why you wrote this book.
Yeah, so the book kind of grew out of, on a functional side, the book grew out of my master's work, which was looking at black bear human conflict over trash management, starting in Boulder, Colorado. So I'd moved down there. I'd always really liked bears, but where I grew up, I didn't have any bears that lived near me in Canada, although you would think that Canada would have a lot of bears, just not where I lived. And so when I moved to Boulder, I kept seeing all of these black bears getting into the garbage can, and then they were also being euthanized or shot, typically by wildlife managers, because they posed a threat to humans, which, typically not so much the case. But if something were to happen, the city would be concerned. So I've been kind of monitoring those bears for quite some time. I love bears. I love to see them coming down and sleeping in trees in town, and I was really passionate about that. And then after I graduated with my degree in environmental journalism, I just kept doing bear stories. So this was around the time that the Yellowstone grizzly, they're pushing to delist it, and one of the many delisting. They've done it a few times, but I think this was the second one. So I was covering that for High Country News magazine, which you might be familiar with. And then I started to look into some polar bear conflict stuff again around kind of climate change and landfills as well in parts of the Arctic. And I think one day I just Googled and I thought I came across there were 8 bears. And I remember thinking, it's a really good number for a book because 8 is a very manageable book number to go and look at each species. And then I couldn't really find the book that I wanted to read, which was looking at some of these lesser known species like the sloth bear or like the moon bear. And so at that stage, I started to think, maybe a book looking at what's happening to all of these other bear species around the world. And they're very geographically diverse. That seemed interesting. And yeah, it kind of just went from there.
Excellent. Well, we're glad that you included all of the species. I think this is probably the first bear book that we've read that includes all of the species. So that's been great for us. Who were you writing it for? Who did you imagine your audience to be?
I think it was definitely a general audience and hopefully targeting, earth sign enthusiasts, which it seems like it's found its audience. But I was pursuing environmental journalism, so I was looking for like a general demographic, maybe kind of like scientific nonfiction, read other books, I guess, like of wolves and Barry Lopez kind of things like that, Elizabeth Colbert, like those sorts of, popular nonfiction, I guess, was the genre that I was in mind. And I didn't want to have a really, I too had read a lot of kind of books written by bear biologists that were very much looking at like the science specifically of the bear, but I wanted it to be kind of a hybrid between environmental journalism and a travel log, I guess, that was very accessible for people who just kind of wanted to learn a little bit more about each of these other animals told through me, told through someone, right? Who can kind of guide them through the world of bears.
Well, and can you talk about that a little bit more? Because that's one thing that we've noticed, right? I mean, it is a book about bears, but it's also a book about kind of your experience of various bears, right? There's the logistics of making the trip, and there's the logistics of finding the bears. Why was it important, or why did it end up that your experience wound up being kind of a part of the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just kind of a tool that makes certain topics more accessible for people. I think that as a journalist too, like it was a bit uncomfortable at first whenever you're having to pivot into writing in first person and like sharing how you're feeling and sharing your experiences. Like that's a bit unnatural because normally as a reporter, like I don't ever use like the word I, right? It's just like you are neutral and you're observing and you're not sharing your opinion. But I think for these sorts of books, like readers like to kind of feel like they have a bit of a connection to you and like why you care. I'd also say too, in addition to showcasing the bears, it's very much showcasing the people who are working to save the bears, right? Like I think bears can't speak for themselves. You have to find the right people to tell their stories for each species, right? The kind of the champions of these bears, and in some cases also, the perpetrators for why they're struggling as well, whether it's hunters or bile farmers. But I think one other thing too is that we were speaking before. I mean, each of these chapters and each of the bears can kind of stand it alone. They can kind of be their own thing. And I think having myself as a character or a voice, right? It's the connective tissue, I think, between the chapters and between the bears as well. So I think that's important for a book.
That's a great point about having that connective tissue. And I do want to reiterate that point for anybody who hasn't, made it through the whole book just yet. And I think we talked about this at an earlier meeting. It is a book that can be read kind of by dipping into it, right? I have loved reading, through the chapters 1 through 8. But if all you wanted to do was read about polar bears, you could just read about polar bears. And if all you wanted to do was read about spectacled bears, you could just read that chapter. So if you're feeling like, oh my God, I don't have time to read the whole book,
I might add a disclaimer as well, because I feel like this will come up. People keep asking or complaining that there's not a separate sun bear chapter. And just in case someone brings that up later, because there's 7 chapters, 8 bears, but 7 chapters for the bears. That was because of COVID. So a lot of the reporting was being done. A lot of the books that are coming out, roughly now were probably written and reported around the era of COVID. So I'd been planning to go to the Bornean Sun Bear Conservation Center and looking at palm oil and sun bears. However, COVID hit. I was not done all the travel for the book. Similarly, some of the grizzly bear chapters were impacted by that too. So in case anyone wants to ask why there's no sun bear chapter, it's lumped in with the moon bear. That is why. So.
Excellent. Thank you for that disclaimer and that important point. I'm tempted to open it up to questions from the group right now. I do have one other question to ask, but you've done such a good job of setting it up. If we were to open it up for questions right now, would people be willing to raise their hands and ask questions? Okay, excellent. So people are willing to start asking questions. I have questions in my back pocket, which we can go back to if we need to. A word about questions. Normally, I just go in the order that Zoom tells me you all have raised your hands. I will probably do that today, but I might break the order because we want to make sure that everybody has a chance to ask questions. So please do ask questions. Forgive me if I hop around in terms of calling on people, and maybe just ask one question at a time so that other people, it'll be like the Brooks Falls platform. Ask your question, get the answer, go to the Riffles platform, and then raise your hand and come back. So that everybody has a chance to get their questions in. And I see hands raised from Marley and then Naomi. Go ahead, Marley.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for joining us. One of the things I was interested in each chapter was the different places that you visited and the people that you interviewed, and obviously those were choices. And I wonder if you could share your process for how you decided for each, I'm telling the exact process for each bear, but you obviously had a process of where you were going to go, what kind of place you wanted to go, and who you wanted to interview. If you could share a little bit about how that process worked.
Yeah, so thank you, Marley. I actually, no one's asked me that question before. One of the kind of it was very pragmatic in some ways, but the way that I found the characters was through looking up, are you guys familiar with the IUCN, kind of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature? So they have these specialist groups and they have bear specialist groups. So they have co-chairs of the spectacled bear has one or two people, scientists who co-chair that kind of chapter. And so for a lot of the bears, I started by going to see who was leading the specialist group for each of those species, which means they are like the global expert for that bear. So Russ Van Horn, who I accompanied in Peru, is one of them. I'm trying to think. Tuan Bendixson, who's associated with Animals Asia, is one as well. So I started with that, and I would email them and ask if they were going, if they had any field work coming up, if they had plans to travel to that area, right? Because I was in Canada at the time or in the US at the time. So I was hoping that, they had an expedition plan that I could go with them. And so typically that's how it worked out. There were also some people that I did meet, quite a few people in Ecuador and Peru who weren't in the book because it just didn't quite fit with the narrative in the end. So there were tons more people who I did meet and did travel with and do more things, but it just didn't quite fit in the end. So yeah, typically the scientists, there were things like the biofarmers, the hunters, who kind of just came up through working various connections to try and get in touch with those people. But yeah, typically it was the IUCN that I was working with. So.
Did you get a lot of support or resistance, or were they like, well, somebody was interested?
They were pretty good. I had a funny experience. So Russ, he worked for the San Diego Zoo, and they initially wanted to charge me like $10,000 to accompany him. And then he got wind of it and he was like, no, like, that's not what we do. And he's like, no, come with me. San Diego Zoo was a bit weird about me wanting to, because it's like a commercial project, I guess. They were like, you have to pay us to talk to Russ. And he was quite mad about it when he got wind of it, because journalists, we can't do that. We also can't do that ethically. We can't pay sources. Right. Yeah. So that was a bit odd, but yeah, most people were really happy, especially the people who are working on the lesser known bears. They were really happy to have that outreach. And some of the scientists, Andrew DeRoche, who heads the polar bear lab at the University of Alberta, I knew him from before because I'd done lots of polar bear stories over the years. So there were some folks who I'd already just knew and went back with them. But yeah, mostly it was just a Google search as to who was the best person in the world to speak to about that bear.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marley. Naomi, you're next. And people, you can raise your hands and ask questions.
Hi, welcome, Gloria. I think you may have answered my first question about travel during COVID. So I'm assuming this was 2020 and when traveling in Alaska was near impossible. But I had a question about a lot of the themes were bears in trouble, man versus nature thematically. And I kept looking for where are the, man and nature together working it out kinds of stories. Always looking for a little bit of hope whenever I, read something where I feel sad.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a really with any book kind of looking at the natural world and I think biodiversity these days, it is this delicate balance between the kind of grim reality, which is that we are, you know, in this sixth extinction crisis, and not leaving readers feeling too depressed. And so I mean, I try to do that with like the biobears. I try to look at Vietnam, which is making progress, of course, at, you know, shutting down biofarms. I looked at, you know, all the money that's been poured into panda conservation in China and the creation of the national parks. I think it's tricky though, and you know, I had this conversation quite a bit with my editor too, of like, do you kind of leave readers with like this, you know, very hopeful ending, right? And I think I have this conversation a lot in my day job as well, because I work with Reuters as a global environment correspondent. And, you know, I think there was this kind of structural trend maybe 5-6 years ago where you did often be like, you would paint a very dark picture and then you go, but there's still hope. And it'd be like, well, that doesn't quite correspond to what we just learned. So I think as a journalist, I wanted to be very realistic about what's the threats facing bears and like what kind of, you know, especially for polar bears, like we know we have scientific evidence that most polar bear populations will go extinct, right? So I think as a journalist, I have to report the factual side of that. And it is very, I mean, for a popular read, it is depressing, right? You don't want people to like leave thinking that, but it is the truth and it is the reality. We can't regrow sea ice, and carbon emissions are, you know, we're on track for 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. But for me, it was just trying to find the people, the scientists, the conservationists who were doing like that hopeful work and trying to, you know, show the people who really cared and were passionate about these bears. And I get that it's not always, and unfortunately, man and nature like is not the overwhelming narrative right now, I think, in the world. Unfortunately, it is very much man versus nature in terms of consumption and climate change and all of these things. So
yeah. I mean, I think it is the overwhelm. I just think, you know, there are some stories. I just interviewed a woman who wrote a children's book about you know, creatures and wildlife who are climate heroes. And it's, you know, and I work in a climate group voluntarily, and you know, it's just there's so many. Your stories needed to be told, and I'm very happy you wrote this book. But it's like, oh yeah, let's have her speak to our climate group because we need some hope in here after, you know, all the things that we know we have to fight because, you know, because of climate change and because we don't know how to get along with wild creatures. I'll stop there. Thank you.
sure. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Naomi. Lori, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, so in that was going to be my question was, do you feel hopeful for some of these bears, you know, in light of like the sloth bear, the growing population there and the climate losses, you know, that the polar bears deal with? Do you feel hopeful for the future of some of these bears?
I think that there are glimmers of hope. I was speaking to Stacy just before this call that they just discovered a population of like 60 Andean bears in Bolivia, or spectacled bears in Bolivia this week, and they didn't know this population was there before. There's all these cute images of the bears playing in the forest. I think there are glimmers of hope. I think when you look at places like, you know, as a Yosemite, if you've gotten to the black bear chapter yet, you know, looking at how Yosemite drastically changed, you know, kind of garbage management and therefore bear management. And it's been a really beautiful story. I think Vietnam, we are seeing bear biofarms being shut down, and bear biofarming will finally be done there, hopefully within the next couple of years. I think for the species that are impacted by climate change, so especially polar bears, I think that is not so hopeful. I think it is a very depressing narrative. I think the scientists who work on polar bears will tell you the same thing. They're not that hopeful. You know, it's there was one quote, I can't remember if I put it in the book or not, that always stuck with me, but it was Andy DeRoche, and he said, you know, I became a polar bear biologist because I loved polar bears. He's like, and instead I've had to spend my career like watching everything get fucked up, was his phrase, right? Like, I don't want to be looking at how polar bears are being impacted by climate change. I wanted to like study the majesty of this animal, and instead it's been hijacked by climate change. So yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful for some of the species, but I think for some, like, the writing is on the wall, and I think for others it will take kind of a truly miraculous effort, I think, to turn things around. I think the bears that are threatened, you know, by, you know, palm oil habitat loss, it's much easier it's a much easier issue to solve. I think also anything that has to do with human tolerance is easier as well, right? We can shift attitudes and shift public sentiments, but I think any demise that's being driven by carbon emissions I do not feel hopeful. So
Is there a way that we can support these researchers that are in these other, far-flung parts of the world that are doing this work?
yeah, it's a good question. I think in terms of like this, like scientists typically don't take donations as far as I'm aware. Like I typically donate to Animals Asia. I think which is the group that works on the bile bears. I think I can look up some links and send them over later, but it is sometimes tricky to like to give scientists money, I think, just based on how these things work. Typically it goes through NGOs. So
Yeah, but if there were organizations that can support these scientists and the work they're doing and the education efforts.
yeah, I'll check. I'll find some links. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll forward, thanks, Lori, for asking that, and I'm happy to forward that to the group. And I just want to call out that really heartbreaking quote from, was it Andy D. Roche, that he started to research on polar bears because he loved them, and now he's watching them, fade away.
I relate to that too as an environmental journalist. Like when I was growing up, I just wanted to work for National Geographic and go see all the great animals, and the idea of climate change and the sixth extinction crisis were not on my radar at that point, right? Like it wasn't until I graduated into this market and it's like, this is what you're going to be covering are these very sad stories instead. So
yeah. On that note, Bob, your hand was up first, and then Anne. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, thanks, Stacy and Gloria. Thanks for taking the time to join the club today. You already answered the question I was going to ask when you answered Naomi's question. I was simply going to ask how in the world you can maintain your optimism in the face of such a horrible situation. I mean, 8 bears going to 3 bears in maybe our kids or grandkids' lifetime. And the other question is kind of an offshoot of that was you are clearly a person who loves the natural world, who loves bears, yet you maintain throughout your book such an even-handed objectivity, talking to hunters, the guy that wanted to get the first tag when they opened up the drawing, or the rancher who said she thought 300 or 400 grizzlies was pretty much what we needed in the U.S. I mean, to maintain your objectivity and your optimism in the face of just such, to my mind, horrible situations. My hat's off to you. I was going to ask you how you do it, but you're a journalist, and I guess that's what you guys do. You have a tough job for something that you clearly love. Anyway, my hat's off to you.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I'm glad that you see me as an optimist. I think I'm a realist maybe. Hopefully optimistic at times. Yeah, I mean that's a tricky one.
Optimist, wrong word. Realist is better.
Yeah, slightly optimistic. Yeah. I think that's a good question. I mean, I think part and parcel of being a journalist is I think just being able to try and be objective and speak to everyone and try and see their side of things at times. When I was speaking with what was her name? Trish? Yeah, the rancher I'm blanking on her name now too.
I've forgotten her name, but yeah.
Tracy B something, Bradley or something like that.
Yeah, Trina Jo Bradley, yes. Okay. I think, when she was making the points about, you don't have to live with grizzly bears, imagine leaving your house and seeing, I that resonates with me a little bit, right? Like I love hiking. I do feel more nervous and scared when I'm hiking in grizzly bear territory, right? Like there's a shift there. However, I think a lot of conservationists, we kind of put that aside because we believe in like the value of these animals on the landscape more so than just having humans and cows everywhere. But I try to see that point. There was a scene that got cut from the book as well, where I had gone to, I was in Vietnam, this is in the same bear farming village. And I went in and there was, I think it got cut from the book anyway. There was a cub. Was that in the book? There was a cub that was being kept on one of the bile farms. And then the owner showed up, and there were these like 3 sisters, And they were like super friendly. Like they took me back to their house. And then when I was leaving, they wanted my phone number. And I was like, why do they want my phone number? And they're like, oh, can you teach our daughter English? Like, can you like keep in touch with us and like, you know, help our daughter learn English? And like, we love you. You know, it's very weird, right? Like you see these terrible things, but then people can be like kind, like separate from that, right? Like I think that that's kind of a conundrum that we deal with, where you're like, you're seeing this one thing, same with the trophy hunter, but when you're just having a conversation, like everything seems fine. So yeah, trying to, I guess, see different perspectives of things. Even, you know, the bear farming stuff too. Like my mom would always say, like, how could you, you know, these people are pure evil. Like, how could you, you know, this is just so awful. But then I'd also think like factory farming in the Canada and the US is quite similar, right? Like my mom eats meat. And I'm like, this isn't that different. Like the way that we keep cattle and pigs and chickens in some cases is very similar to how the bile bears are being kept. So just trying to keep like that, I think, yeah, that level of thinking, I guess helps. And also I think people deserve to hear like why like, you have to understand why these things are happening to like change things too, right? Like you have to understand those perspectives if you're going to change people's minds. So thank you.
And yeah, thanks, Bob. And I just want to say, Gloria, that the things that you just talked about in the bile farm chapter, the equanimity, I think, especially came up in that chapter, and the parallels to, you know, several of us thought about factory farming after reading that chapter. So that worked. Thank you. Anne, and then Elizabeth.
Gloria, thank you so much for delivering to us an incredible mixture of passion, positivity, science that was accessible, and love. So obviously, really wonderful delivery. My question is, I think we understand the kind of nadir times with the bile farming, although you were objective and still human there. Was there a time where you had a pinnacle, an apogee of joy in particular during the experience of your 7 chapters?
Well, that's a good question, Emma.
What a beautiful question. That was beautifully
That's a very nice
articulated.
question, very positively framed as well. You know, I don't know, like it's kind of an unfair answer, but I love the cloud forests, but I did not see a bear there. It was just such a beautiful, rich ecosystem that I would like love to just go back to and spend months there. Like, you know, the humming of the throat, like the vibrations of the hummingbird wings, right? Like they're just all around you all the time. You can hear it, like it just stimulates every single sense. And I would love to go back and see a spectacled bear in that area. But I was really happy. I had a really lovely time, and it was really, really amazing to see these cloud forests and these ecosystems and be following the trail of the bears that had moved through that ecosystem. When I was in a nature reserve in Sichuan in China as well. I mean, I guess my experiences are when I didn't see bears, which is quite funny. But just knowing that they're out there, I think there's something to be in a really purely wild place and knowing that like these bears are roaming nearby. I think that that's a very magical feeling versus seeing a bear, but having it be maybe in a construction site, as I've seen some grizzly bears before, have them be in that kind of like human interface where it's not like it's how you pictured it. I think, yeah, when I was in the Min Mountains in Sichuan, and we'd seen wild panda poop earlier that day. We did not see a panda. But again, it was just a beautiful ecosystem. There were golden monkeys nearby. Like to know that I was so close to them, I think that was really joyful and special, and that they were living these truly wild lives, which is why we weren't seeing them, right? Like sometimes you take comfort in the fact that you haven't seen it because it's out there being a bear far away from humans. I think that that's my answer, which isn't, you know, or I could have said feeding a panda at the, you know, feeding a panda was quite fun, but, you know, maybe not quite the same thing.
Thank you. Anne, and then Natalie.
You forgot me.
Sorry, I meant Anne Elizabeth.
Oh,
And then Natalie, sorry.
I only go by Elizabeth. Well, thank you so much, Gloria, for being here with us and for writing a very interesting book, you know, and it was beautifully written. I wanted to know, and if you've answered this previously, then I'll pass, but I wanted to understand what your motive was, your intent for writing the book and your purpose. And I'm talking about a personal purpose, not a journalistic one. What was it inside your soul that made you want to find out about each of these bears? And I particularly liked the spectacle bear. I just fell in love with that bear. And I feel particularly bad for the moon bear and just wish there was something that can be done about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think that like my fundamental kind of drive was that I did want people to know that there were these other 4 or so bears that existed and what was happening to them. I think that like there are a lot of books that have been written, you know, Charlie Russell about brown bears. There's a lot of books that have been written about polar bears and panda bears. And that kind of takes me to the title of the book too, which I normally get that question of like, you know, how did you come on? I didn't like the title of 8 Bears at first. I thought it was very just like boring and, you know, it's about 8 bears. It's not very inventive or literary. But my editor was like, no, like I think like when you say it, people are surprised to know that there's only 8 bears left in the world. But then when you ask them to name the 8 bears, they can only name 4. Right. So like, I think like it was kind of, I think it was that compulsion to try and get people to learn, you know, what was happening to spectacled bears, which I'm glad that you quite like, what was happening with sloth bears, what was happening to moon bears and sun bears. Some people know what sun bears are, but I think for the most part, they don't. These are very forgotten bear species. People tend to think of bears as only living in Europe and North America and not anywhere else, except for the panda. Although a lot of people think that pandas aren't bears, which is a fun reaction that I often get. So I think just trying to like draw attention to their plight and to let people know how in trouble those species are. You know, as I said in the book, American black bears, maybe we see these kind of snapshots of conflict and tension, and the takeaway is incorrect, which is that this is a very imperiled species because we're seeing these moments of conflict in North America. But in reality, the American black bear is doing really well. Brown bears are also doing pretty well. Polar bears, people know what's happening with polar bears, but all of these other lesser known species are all vulnerable to extinction right now. And with a lot of like the sun bears, someone asked me the other day, they asked how many spectacled bears were left in the wild. And like for a lot of these animals, like we don't even know how many are left. It could be 5,000, it could be 10,000, it could be 2,000. The sun bear is like the world's least studied bear, so most people don't even know, you know, where it lives or how many are left. So I think from like a personal level, like that's what I think I wanted to achieve with the book. I think, well, you know, journalists, there's kind of that internal struggle of, you know, a lot of people are motivated by creating awareness. They want to create change. I think, and this is probably like the cynic in me coming out, like I don't think that we need like more awareness to make it like people know what's happening to the world, and like we haven't unfortunately changed a lot of what needs to change. So I don't think that I was driven by like I want to write a book to change the world, right? Like I just don't have like that. I am a little disillusioned with that, I think. But I think a lot of journalists, we feel more of you want to document what we're losing, right? Like, and sometimes that's a sad thing. It's not so much that you that you think it's going to change the world, but that someone should keep track of what's being lost. I was talking to Stacey. I've been working on coral reefs right now, coral reef ecology. I've been speaking with a lot of coral reef scientists, and we're in a mass bleaching event again. And he was saying, you know, we've seen hundreds of millions of corals die. Like as a scientist, like I go out and I dive the reef every day. It's too late for corals. We're going to lose all the coral reefs in the world with climate change. But I want to document, you know, it's like, you know, it's like a cemetery, right? You want to document what's dying, what's died. So that's maybe how I feel.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for that question. Thanks, Gloria, for the answer. And just for the group, like I invite us to think about, you know, to what extent did Gloria achieve that goal with our group? How has that goal been achieved in your reading of this book? Natalie, and then we will have no hands left. So if you have a question, now's a good time to raise your hand. Natalie, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe it kind of ties into what we've been talking about. You've been mentioning a little bit about this kind of like combination of, you know, environmental nonfiction and a travel log and kind of building in your personal experiences and stuff, and how that's maybe a new experience for you. I was wondering if you ever came across a situation where you kind of got a feeling that maybe this was either a politically kind of controlled message that you were getting, or just a line that you just felt like you couldn't get over, or maybe there just wasn't enough information about maybe a bear or something, so you just felt like that was the only information you could, so that you had to put it in the book, but you were getting like a different feeling, like a different vibe, and like what that was. I was just curious because maybe it was pandas, maybe it was the bio bears. Like, I just, on the top of my head, I was just curious if you felt something different than what was in the book.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Natalie. It's a good one. I think like in terms of access, like what I couldn't get, I mean, I think it would have been really interesting to have explored more of like those parallels between bio bears and pandas in China, and the reality is that you're not going to be able to report on any kind of bear farming in China. I mean, even pandas, a lot of the reporting, I mean, the scientist that I interviewed, Papa Panda, that took me almost 2 years to get that interview. He was very difficult to reach. It took a lot of like knowing someone who knows someone who knows someone. There was a lot of, I was also doing some work when I was there too, separately for a magazine feature about the forced relocations to create Giant Panda National Park, right? China has a history of forcing people to relocate for things like the Three Gorges Dam and these major infrastructure projects, but they are doing the same thing as well for protected areas in China too, right? They're forcing people to move and looking at that tension. And we had some issues with like running into government officials and things when we were working in China. But I think, one of the things that was maybe a little, I think I'm a little like TBD on like China's efforts to release the captive bred pandas into the wild. Like, I mean, we'll see what happens with that. I don't know how hopeful that is. I'm hoping it works well. So far, like, as I said, like there's only fewer than 20 have been released and like survived in the wild. But China's billing that as like, we're doing all of these centers, because we're going to put them in the wild, but it's like, no, they're using it to get money. So I think like China, I mean, the panda is probably like the most obvious one there. And again, like, as I think I mentioned in the book briefly, like in Chengdu, one of the sanctuaries for the bio bears is just down the street from the panda breeding, the panda conservation center. So you have like China, I mean, it's China treats them so differently, right? It's really sad that you have one bear that's just received. And it's strange to me too, because like moon bears are very cute, right? Like, it's not like one bear is like not a cute animal. Like, why is this one animal that's like slightly cuter than the other, like so much more beloved? So yeah, I think like that side of things, I think it was quite startling in some cases just to see like how few people are actually working on some of these lesser known bears. Like to the first question's point about like how did I find like some of these people, like in some cases like there's maybe only a handful of scientists who are even like working on one bear. Like the spectacled bear doesn't have a huge army of scientists compared with brown bears or polar bears. So there's maybe like 20 people in the world who really study this bear, and it's increasing. I was quite heartened. There were so many young women in Peru and Venezuela and Bolivia who were like really getting into like spectacled bear conservation, which I think whole new generation coming up. But at the time, like, yeah, in terms of like the old guard with that bear, maybe like 3 or 4 people who followed that bear for a long time. But yeah, I guess just China is my answer for everything. I had pretty good access. Otherwise, I would have loved to look at bears in Russia. I don't think that will be happening anytime soon. Russia's kind of a bit of a black box at times with kind of brown bear and polar bear things, but it's a huge bear stronghold in terms of population. So it's maybe something else in the future if things ever change.
Gosh, I feel like you could do a whole book on bears in Russia, and we would totally read that book.
I think cultural crossover with like bears in Russia is also really fascinating. There's such a rich history there, and there's also this weird industry of like Russian men with like brown bears on social media. I don't know if anyone's ever seen these, but like it's just like what is going on with this whole. Yeah. That's an expose unto itself as to what is happening in Russia and bears. So
there's a really great book. I think it's called, oh gosh, is it In the Eye of the Wild? It's by a woman and a female anthropologist who had a bear encounter, I think in Russia, and then she go to Poland.
That book it came out a few years ago, didn't it? Like it's a newer book. Yeah, I remember coming across that. I haven't read it, but I've come across that book too and heard good things. So
I loved it. We haven't read it as a group, but I think it's a fascinating book. Partly for what it says about bears, and partly for what it says about like bears in culture.
Okay, I'll have to check it out. Thanks.
So a couple of Naomi has her hand raised, then Elizabeth, and then Stacy has her hand raised, and then we'll welcome others. Naomi, go ahead.
Just on that last note, the National Park Service does have a relationship with some of the parks in Russia that have bears. There is a connection there if you want to pursue it at some point.
Yeah, now there's the polar bears. Apparently, the information's continuing to travel back and forth. It's been a bit tricky because of U.S. institutions saying that Russian researchers in U.S. can't collaborate. But I think that, yeah.
But with brown bears as well. But I wanted to know, in your journey, what scientifically did you find that was most surprising?
That's a good question. Let me think back to all of the findings that I poured through. I think like the impacts on hibernation, as I kind of reacted to in the book, was really fascinating to me, that like some bears are no longer hibernating. I also thought it was quite interesting that not all bears hibernate. I don't think that I knew that before I started working on the book, that a lot of the warmer weather bears, like of course they don't hibernate. But that because of food availability and because of climate change, some populations are no longer really truly hibernating anymore. That was quite interesting to me. I think I was also surprised, sadly, that most of the polar bear populations would go extinct. That was quite a shocking study to me when it came out, and I covered it as a journalist for news, covering that first. I also had one, this wasn't in the book, but this was another story that I did, which was that when I've been reporting on polar bears, I had seen a little soapstone carving in one of the museums in Churchill, Manitoba, and it was of a polar bear that was this is more of a fun story, so it's not, it's to add some levity, but it was holding a little rock or a stone of ice above a seal or a walrus, and it was like going to throw it down on the seal. And I remember thinking, I took a photo of it and I was like, oh, it's weird, like it's, bludgeoning the seal with a rock. And a couple of years later, a study came out that found that polar bears do in fact use tools, and they do in fact use rocks and things to try and bludgeon walrus and seal in the wild. And this was something that had been observed from indigenous knowledge for years. Indigenous people said that they did this, and Western researchers were like, no, they don't do this. But they had like GoPros attached to polar bears, and they saw them like picking up and throwing things. So that was really interesting and exciting. And that's obviously someone had witnessed this, and that's why it informed this little statue. But that was a cool finding, I thought, that they use tools. And also intelligence. I think bear intelligence was really fascinating to me too.
Yeah, they're pretty smart.
Yeah, I had no clue that they were that smart. Like, I knew that they were smart, but I was shocked by like how smart they are.
Yeah, they're really smart. If we only paid more attention to indigenous oral histories, we might learn a little more. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. Elizabeth, Stacy, and then Lori.
So this again has to do with your process of writing. So you went to a lot of places that are a bit dicey. And I wanted to know how, what kind of protections or people or how did you protect yourself? In other words, did you have people who either knew where you were, or were you with people who carried arms or whatever was needed to protect in any of the environments which were more hostile? Like, for example, the anteater bear that has the gigantic claws. I can't remember which one that is, whether it was moon or sun or spectacled. Anyway, I know one of them can be very dangerous if you happen to get near them, but they're very shy. And other places like polar bears or grizzlies or whatever. I mean, you're walking around in forests, you don't know where the bears are. So what was your means of protecting yourself? Did you have a satellite phone, or,
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I was surprised by how many of the bear species are actually, they're pretty nice. Like sun bears are quite nice. Spectacled bears are pretty like nice as far as bears go. So in that case, no. The only bear I think that was polar bears I didn't get up close. I was supposed to be on a helicopter tagging polar bears initially. Again, COVID ruined many things. So that I think we would have had, and I think when we were in Churchill, I was with Polar Bears International, which is a conservation NGO, and they did have a flare gun and they had a shotgun. And I worked in Svalbard too. And again, you have to be someone who has a gun if you leave town. So those things were all happening. I think the sloth bear made me the most nervous, as I think I said, just because I'd seen so many horrific injuries by the time I actually saw one. But we did not have any. I was with scientists, so I kind of deferred to the scientists, I guess, to know what was safe, right? Like if I had just been going in up to a sloth bear by myself, I probably wouldn't have done that. But he kind of could read them. He knew what was okay for us, how close to get. We had a car, right? So you kind of hid behind the car when you were out and you could get back to it quickly. And then, a lot of the time it wasn't necessarily, I guess it was just the scientists were my protection, and hopefully I could run faster than them is kind of the answer. But no, I mean, I've seen grizzly bears, through Banff National Park and places like that. And you're just observing from a pretty safe distance, but you do have someone there who has, bear spray. I often had bear spray with me. Panda's probably not going to attack you. I think I was most concerned about snakes in a lot of the places, poisonous snakes. That was more so what I was worried about compared with maybe a bear attacking me. A lot of in China, there were some really venomous snakes. So that was more so what I was thinking of, I think. And then and sadly, the moon bear, a lot of the bears I saw were in cages, right? They weren't wild bears. I mean, moon bears do attack people actually quite a bit. Japan just had a record year for bear attacks, and a lot of those are Asiatic black bears or moon bears, unlike some of Hokkaido and some other places. And that's thought to be in part because of climate change. Their natural foods are failing. So they're coming into conflict with people in Japan. 2020, if you look up stories, there's some really interesting ones from last year about what's happening in Japan. But yeah, I never felt, I think as a writer, sometimes I actually wish there had been a bit more danger and close calls, because that's what people want to read about. Near misses or slight attacks. But no, I felt pretty safe most of the time. People maybe less so, but yeah, bears were fine.
So I expected you to say poisonous snakes would be in the more tropical areas. I'm surprised there are
I was surprised too. Yeah. No, in China, they have some very venomous pit vipers. I mean, it's not tropical, but it's, warmer in Sichuan province. But yeah, they had quite a lot of snakes. Yeah, Peru, Ecuador. I mean, I guess there were pumas around. They're smaller near the equator, but I thought of that as well. But yeah, typically it's not so much, I guess, the wildlife that you're fearful of.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll use this one first. I mean, Gloria, you've mentioned a couple of times that COVID interfered with your travel plans. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the places that you wanted to go but couldn't, or the things that you wanted to do but couldn't? And on behalf of the group, I will ask, was Katmai on your list?
Thanks, Stacey. Yeah, let me back up. So I mean, most people are surprised with how long a book takes to do. So the book began in 2017. So I had started pitching it then, and I was starting to do some reporting, went to China in 2018, then sold the book proposal. And so 2019, 2020 was my plan for most of the travel for the book. And I got through a lot of it in 2019. The things that I'd still wanted to do was Borneo for the sun bears, helicopter flight back up to Churchill, because the first time that I went to Churchill, I did not get very close with the polar bear. The sea ice came in, and as I wrote in the book, they all left, and I was like, oh, it didn't. It's very frustrating. So sun bears, I was supposed to go with Andy DeRoche every spring in May. He gets a helicopter and they go up to Western Hudson Bay and they dart the polar bears and they put tags on them and they do health checks on all the polar bears. So it's, you're sometimes you're holding cubs, you're looking at the big polar bear paws. That got canceled. And then I'd wanted to go back to Yellowstone to do more reporting on Yellowstone delisting and speak with more people there. And a lot of that chapter had to do with Chris Servine, who was in the book. I wanted to go down and hang out with him and talk to him. And a lot of that was done by phone for that chapter. I did not consider going to Katmai simply because a lot of the chapters were fairly geographically constrained. So initially, the grizzly bear chapter, I actually had a bunch of Banff National Park as well, because I did a bunch of, and the North Cascades. I had a whole bunch of North Cascades reporting and reintroduction plans for the North Cascades. So I had all this grizzly bear reporting, and it was just like a little bit too unwieldy to be jumping around so much geographically in a chapter. Like most things are, with the exception of Ecuador and Peru, everything else is kind of in one spot, I think. Yeah, black bears, I mean, it's a bit of, yeah, California and maybe a little bit elsewhere. So yeah, with the Alaska thing, I had not considered going to Alaska at the time, just because I felt like I already had too much bear content, brown bear content. I'd also wanted to go to Europe to do some work on the cave bear for like the opening chapter. Again, COVID. But looking at some of those kind of Neolithic paintings and like the culture of bears in Europe, I thought would have been really interesting. And now I live here, so I can, do that for fun. But that was disappointing too. So yeah, I think, I was lucky that I'd done like enough to kind of still be able to put a book together. But I know a lot of my friends who are authors really struggled because they'd planned all of their work for 2020 and they didn't get there. So
That's fascinating. It's fascinating to me to know how long this book took. And I would say only that there's no such thing as too much brown bear content. And I hope you have a chance to visit Alaska at some point, either for a book or just for yourself. Okay, it is 5 till 4, and there are 2 hands raised. If you have a comment or a question that you want to ask, I encourage you to raise your hand soon because we will run out of time. Oh, excellent. So we will go to Lori and then Bob and then Leanne. And if others have questions, please raise your hand.
So many of the conservation and wildlife success stories come about because of publicity and people becoming more and more aware of it, and the momentum just kind of snowballs and people become aware of the issues. So have you been on like here in the US, Good Morning America, the Today Show, any of these big shows where you can get the word out about this, like the biofarms? It just seems to me if more people were aware of that, maybe there was something, public opinion could help to improve that situation. So have you done like any big interviews to, get the word out?
I have not done the TV talk shows. I think partially because I'm also living in the UK now, so it's a bit trickier. I did NPR, so I did a bunch of NPR shows when the book came out. The book received a good amount of press from the New Yorker, the Economist, a lot of those sorts of things, but not so much like me as a spokesperson. I do think that, I think like with the bile bears, I think like the kind of PR machine behind some of these NGOs like Animals Asia, Free the Bears, like they're so good, and they're very effective communicators. I would say I've been working a little bit more from behind the scenes, working with Reuters, which is that I make sure that a lot of bear stories get done. And I try to, like, for example, like our Vietnam Bureau is now working on like a bile bear story. And Reuters, our audience is 1 billion people per day. So it's the biggest media outlet in the world. So having that kind of reach and leverage to try and highlight some of these bear issues, I think I can kind of do things that way. If you know some at Good Morning America, I'd be happy to I'd be happy to go on, but I have not been invited, unfortunately. Yeah.
That's great that you're still getting the word out in other ways. So keep on doing those bear stories on all these perilled bears. That's great.
I agree, Lori, and thanks for asking that question. And just for anybody who doesn't know, Gloria, I was glad to see the book honored as one of the best of the year from the New Yorker and the Economist. I think that those kinds of awards help boost visibility and readership.
Definitely helpful. Yeah.
Bob and then Leanne.
Yeah, I was just going to say it'd be nice to be on Good Morning America, but to be one of the Economist's best books of the year, that's pretty cool in itself. Just one quick comment and one quick question. That you've already mentioned, I think, 2 terrific subsequent books. One could be about reintroduction of species. Start with the reintroduction of the bears up in the North Cascades, maybe kind of segue into wolves, in different parts of the states, there could be a terrific book there. The other one is a history of the bear in Europe. I mean, that would be absolutely
That book
great.
exists. That book exists. I'll
Okay.
send a link to that one too. Yeah.
So whatever your next book or books are, the question is, would you please do them the same way as this one, in that, yeah, you wrote this for a general population, a general readership, but it was wonderful having those notes in the back. I mean, that's going to give me reading material over the next year. I mean, go to one of the, Gale databases or something like that and pull out these articles. But I thought that was immensely helpful, which, we don't usually see in a general readership book. Thank you for that.
I'm glad that you like the notes. That took me almost as long as writing the book itself, was compiling those notes. So,
well, in addition to the notes, I mean, those were terrific. But I was so envious when I read your acknowledgments. You've had some amazing people that you've run across. I mean, the scientists, your friends, the educators. I mean, your colleagues. That was really impressive as well. I love the acknowledgments.
I mean, I think that's one of the special things about being a journalist, is that you get to meet so many people and keep in touch. I still talk to a lot of the bear biologists all the time, and we share notes and stories about bears. I will actually flag, for those of you who haven't seen this week, that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service finally finished their environmental impact assessment for bringing grizzly bears back to North Cascades. So it's a big step forward. That's taken like more than a decade to get to this point. Fingers crossed, if there's no change of government, it won't go back again, because that keeps happening, where these, whoever's in charge of those agencies starts or stops the process. But I know conservationists have been fighting for so long to try and get bears reintroduced to the Cascades. So seemingly we're moving in that way, which is really exciting to see. I actually didn't think that they would get there, so I'm really heartened by that. Speaking of those glimmers of hope, yeah. And yeah, if I do future books, I will make sure to leave lots of notes and acknowledgements. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob, for that question. And I agree, the notes were fabulous. And we are so grateful for the voices of the conservationists that you brought into the book. What a great way for us to meet those people and hear their voices. That's fabulous. Leanne and then Elizabeth. Leanne, go ahead.
I really, really enjoyed your book. And when you were talking about bears in Europe, you should have a look at the Mexican brown bear in Italy, a really small subspecies. It very endangered. But my question really, in a sense, was other people's. But I need to know, the tea you bought in China that was fertilized by panda poo, what kind of tea was it, and was it good? I know it's not as sensible as everyone else's, but I really desperately needed to know. What kind of tea, and was it good?
Oh, it was good. I was trying to remember what it was, like a buckwheat. It wasn't a green tea, and it wasn't like the normal. It was kind of a sweet, like, I want to say it was like a buckwheat tea or something like that. It was a strange tea, but it was pretty good. I had a cute little.
I really needed to know. I love tea.
Well, as you're British, then I'm.
I am. I was like, oh, I need to know. Thank you.
And it's funny you should mention the Italian. I just met someone actually earlier this week who is a wildlife filmmaker, and he's working on a documentary about the Marskin
brown bear. Yes,
yeah.
Population, and they're very isolated, and people don't know about them. I've only ever been able to find one book on them by Roger Thompson.
I think too, it's been interesting to see European bear conflicts kind of reaching a peak too lately. Like was
it in Slovenia has been on the news.
Yeah, I mean, just in the past couple years or so, I mean, there was an Italian jogger who was killed by a bear, and there was that whole drama, and then the Slovakian
the language as well, they call it on a rampage. Well, they've obviously just come out of hibernation, but I think it was like JJ24, I think it was, but I think the education, when they've reintroduced bears in northern Italy, has not been the same like in the States, about putting away your rubbish and stuff like that. I think it's not just not being done as well in Europe. I think it's a big issue. So people are like, oh, bears are running around, and you're like, well, you've got your rubbish everywhere, so they're kind of.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting to watch some of these countries starting to confront like the bear conflict issue here. And again, same with garbage, just more people recreating in some of these areas. They're smaller. My book is actually being translated into Slovakian, which I thought was quite random, but I did do a few Slovakian radio appearances about bears, and they're just very into bears, I think, because of all of these tensions.
In the last week it went wild, didn't it, on the BBC and all that, and it's like, oh God, they just sort of, yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Leanne. Elizabeth and then Stacy on behalf of the chat.
I just wanted to say that in the Grizzly chapter, I really appreciated your making this distinction between the Endangered Species Act and the Wilderness Act. I didn't know about that. And I didn't really understand all the back and forth that had been going on in Yellowstone National Park, nor these populations of bears and how they're trying to integrate them. I thought that was really interesting. And I was also really shocked at some of these hunters who obviously like bears in some ways, you know, looking for tags and even to try to tag bear 399. And of course, we know 399 because we've come to love her. She had 4 cubs, her last litter before this one, where she had 1. And I think she's still alive. I hope she's still alive. Anyway, I just really like those distinctions, and some of your phrasing was really interesting. Like, I love this phrase you use, thresholds of tolerance. I think that really captures what we're dealing with right now when we've got this WUI, the wildlife
Wild and urban
interface.
interface.
Yeah. When with that, the thresholds of tolerance kind of like just hits it the nail on the head. That's what we're dealing with. What are our thresholds of tolerance? And what value systems are underneath those for each of the different perspectives that we've even seen in this book? And the other one that I thought was so interesting were the cultural aspects to this, like in China and a lot of Asia, the true importance of homeopathic remedies and plant remedies and natural remedies. And that is so ingrained. I don't know how you make a change to get people to quit using bile for whatever, you know, ills they have.
Yeah, I remember being really surprised with the bile that it was so cheap. I thought it was like a very expensive market, right? Like, it's, you know, the tiger penis or ivory. But it was like $1, you know, it was like $1 for and this is even in, you know, it's not a huge, it's not like that's like worth an insane amount of money in Vietnam either. Like, it was just really cheap. It was just a status symbol, and it was these traditions, right? And I think, yeah, that's quite when there's not an economic reason to like shift, it makes it even harder in some ways, right? Like, you can't, it's not people's livelihoods, it's just what they like. And yeah, thank you for the comment on the thresholds of tolerance. I mean, I think the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado right now is another one of that, you know, people should be watching closely. But I found, like, when I would ask people how many bears they thought, you know, that kind of got at that question, right? Like, if you, it wasn't a direct, like, what is your tolerance level, but it was like, how many bears do you want? And that was like a good indicator of like where they kind of stood on the issue, I think. Yeah,
I thought that was fascinating. And I couldn't believe the woman, Tina, who's the cattle owner, that she owns a cattle ranch. And I can understand her. She only wants 300 or 400 grizzly bears, you know, and I thought the one that answered that best was the one who said which populations and how many in each population he thought, and he's trying to remember what the guy's name was, but he was the one who was very well educated, been on both sides of the equation. Serving 3,000 to 3,400 he thought was the optimal number, and he broke it down, you know, 2,000 at Yellowstone, Bitterroot 300 to 400, another place, Selkirk, Cabinet Yaak or something like that, 150, and then North Cascades 400. You know, I just thought that was interesting, and I wonder how the numbers change over time.
And Elizabeth, after you, we will go to Lori, and then I'm going to bring a question from the chat. We are running out of time, so if you have a question, now is the time to raise your hand.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, Chris Turbine is, I mean, he is the head honcho, right? He knows US grizzly bears better than anyone in the world because he was the man in charge of recovering the species. So I defer to him on whatever he says is the number. I think the one thing I'll say is, like, and I can send some like further reading if you want with my North Cascades reporting, because I did write a feature on this for a different magazine. But it was really interesting to like interview the very liberal pro-conservation outdoor recreationalists about bringing grizzlies back, because everyone like loves bears, but then there's like this like knee-jerk reaction of like, ooh, actually I'm kind of scared and I don't know. I think that would be a really interesting case to watch of like what happens when you try to bring back a species that can kill you in like a very typically like kind of liberal towards wildlife place. I mean, it's kind of purple in like some of these like the Mythic Valley and stuff, but yeah, I think that would be a fun one to watch just from like a human perspective, because people are very conflicted as to what to do. But there are some of them are just like, I don't want bears, but like I know they need to be here, so I'm willing to not go mountain biking anymore, right? Like I think that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Lori, you're up next.
Yeah, Elizabeth's question about the tolerance that people have for bears got me thinking of this. And it was a question you brought up in the grizzly chapter on how many bears are enough to satisfy the recovery efforts. But the important question was, and who should decide? And I think that's the crux of it when you talk about recovery in these areas, is who gets to decide how many bears are enough in these places, and who gets a voice in it.
Yeah, typically it falls to the state game, state game chapter, right? And but who's also leaning on them, right? So is it the hunters that are leaning on them? Is it the cattle herders, right? Like who's the spheres of influence in terms of like who decides what's enough? And I think with the grizzly bear, that's exactly the tension, because it's also a feds versus states issue, right? It's like who should have the control over this animal. And that's something that we see play out over a bunch of different conservation issues, but it's especially it's especially problematic for grizzly bear management, I think, when you have such a, it's recovered, but it's still like 700. It's not, that, and also the connectivity of species too, right? Like connecting those populations, I think, is important in addition to just pure numbers.
And yeah, it seems like it's also important too for these other bear populations, especially where there's so much interaction, like the sloth bear with the people. It's like, who gets to decide how many they should have there, and in these other areas, who.
Especially for a very volatile species like the sloth bear, where who's dying because of it, right? Like, and like that's such a tension point in that case too, right? Like, and they're very lenient towards sloth bears comparatively to how we behave towards wildlife that kill people in North America. So it's lots of interesting angles.
Lots of issues there.
Yeah, that question of where do you draw the line is a question that we bump up against in almost every book we've read. So thanks, Lori, for raising that. I want to bring forward a question that somebody asked in chat, and this is a question about the tangible book. And then just a warning to the group that I'm going to ask the group a question after this. But Gloria, the question came up in chat about the cover art. Did you have a say in choosing the cover art? And this reminded me too of something that we talked about, that the book uses illustrations rather than photographs. So could you talk about that, and how much of that you got to influence?
Yeah, I've had a lot of complaints that it doesn't use photos, actually.
We just wondered. We weren't complaining. We just wondered.
Yeah, so there's an interesting backstory to the artwork. This was during COVID, and a student at the Savannah Institute of Design reached out to me, and I'd written a story about tigers for the New York Times, and his assignment for class was to draw something from a news article. And so he drew this really beautiful tiger, and sent it to me. He's like, oh, I just wanted to let you know that I did this for a school assignment. And he's from India, actually. And I said, oh, that's so cool. Like, we started talking. I said, I'm working on a book. We started talking about sloth bears. The next thing I know, he'd drawn me like 20 sloth bear photos, amazing sloth bears, just for fun. And he sent them to me. And I said, I'm working on this book. We're going to need artwork. Would you be cool if I reached back out to you in like a year or so, and maybe to have you draw all of the bears for the book? And so, yeah, he like works in San Francisco now as like a graphic designer, but, yeah, this was his first book cover. So he drew all the bears for the book. He became a big fan of sloth bears after this. But no, in terms of choosing, okay, partially like there's like a very like boring answer to like color photos in a book, which is that it increases the cost of the book. So it actually like there's an economics answer to that where like people aren't willing to pay as much for the book, and like I had to pay more, and it was all this weird thing. But I also felt like there's a whimsy to illustrations, right? Like we're so used to like books about bears being illustrated that I felt like it was appropriate to have, I like the idea of having like drawings as opposed to color photos in the middle. I don't know, it just felt like it like fit better for me. So I made that decision. But I have gotten negative feedback about that. I'm like, I feel like people can Google the bears to see photos. But I don't know. I really like the illustrations. We also had all these like stickers that they made too of all the bears. I have them. I can't show my computer is covered in bears on the back now of all the drawings. I can't show you obviously because it's my computer, but yeah. So I personally love the artwork. And they chose to put the black bear, his black bear on the cover. So.
That makes total sense, and I don't think we were complaining. We were curious, not
No,
judgmental.
not you, but some of the like, Goodreads reviews have been like, 1 star because there's no photos.
Well, we did Google, and Janice brought photos of the different bears and used them as her backdrop for every meeting, which has been very helpful. And Natalie has posted in chat that as an artist, she says, I have to thank you for supporting other artists. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
You guys, it is 4:14, so we need to start wrapping up. I have a question for the group. You'll remember that, so we love meeting with authors because it helps us learn stuff it helps us learn, amplify what we've learned from the book, and it helps us learn things like why illustrations were used instead of photographs. So, and I think it's helpful for us to give some feedback to the author. So one of the things that we generally do when we meet with authors, I generally ask the group, how does Gloria's book kind of fit into the curriculum, right, that we've been reading in book club? We read Mike Fitz's book, Bears of Brooks Falls. Sorry, Mike. We read Sherry Simpson's book, Dominion of Bears. We just finished Derek Stonerov's Watch the Bear. We read Barry Gilbert's One of Us, which is over here, and Jeff Fair's book about McNeil River. And I'm just curious, as you think about all of those books that we've read, and as you think about Gloria's book, how does Gloria's book kind of fit into that collection that we've been reading over the last couple of years? Excellent, lots of hands raised. Elizabeth, Naomi, and then Lori. Elizabeth, you're first.
Well, I love the book because I love the writing. It's both accessible and very informed, and I really love that about it. I wanted it to have a little more hopeful stuff in it as well. And I've worked, for ABC television news and other media type of places, so I understand that, and I like the journalistic approach. I just want some vision for the future or a direction toward which people can go. But in terms of the other books, it was like a pillow between them. What I mean by that is all the other books, you were either put in the location of where the bears were, mostly about brown bears, or we just saw it from either a bear's perspective or people observing the bears or the location of the bears. And of course, we all watch the bears on explore.org. So we are always interested in bear behavior and family relationships and the intelligence of bears and the funny things they do and all of that. And I guess I would like to hear more funny stories about bears. But the other thing is we got a great perspective of 8 bears. I think it's fabulous. And I love anything international. So I was enthralled to learn about these bears. I think I fell in love with the sloth bear too. And I'm not sure whether it was the moon bear or the sun bear, but anyway, I loved all those bears. And I think I felt after the moon and sun bear, the bile bears, the poor black bears bothered me the most. Well, the fact that they're eating out of garbage cans and just awful stuff that we've kind of forced them into, and the polar bears losing their ice. I don't know. Anyway, I thought it was a really great book for filling in a ton of gaps and a big puzzle and showing us some new directions that we can look at, and then giving us something to think about, like, what else can we do? what else can we do? Is there anything we can do for those bears that are not so close to us? You know, the bears in Asia and
Great,
I don't
thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to move on to Naomi and
Yeah,
then
sorry.
Lori and then Marley.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I loved the writing in this book. It may have been my favorite of all the books we read. Sorry, Mike, if you're here. But for me, it was a wonderful trip around the world to meet bears that I really didn't know much about. I mean, I live half the year with brown bears, but you know, to have some insight about other bears. And to Elizabeth's point, you know, the study that Mike Fitzen and Professor Lynn Lewis did about the bear cam viewers and people who visit Katmai, those who could identify an individual bear were 70% more likely to contribute to any conservation cause. And so I think that books like this one, like Gloria's, and those stories can help people to do what Elizabeth would like them to do. So thank you for the book.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thanks, Naomi. Lori and then Marley.
Yeah, I echo what Naomi and Elizabeth have said. I love the writing. And I think as a book club, it was really nice to expand our horizons to all these other bear species and the perils that they're facing. Initially, I wanted to learn more about the biology of the individual bears, but I can look that up. And so it was nice to learn about what the dangers they're facing are and what can we do to address those issues and help make their environment safer for them. And so it was very enjoyable, depressing at times, but a real learning experience. And I've enjoyed the book very much. So thank you for writing it and opening my eyes to a lot of issues that I guess I knew were there, but this, you know, put it right in front of me. And so now maybe I can contribute money to something to help make a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah. Marley, go ahead.
I also echo what everyone said. I loved your writing style. I loved the sort of journalistic approach, because you're a journalist, that you took to your writing, which is very different. I mean, I love the other books too, but it's just very different, the journalistic approach. And I also echo learning about the other bears. I also very much enjoyed the conversations that you had with people who maybe I didn't agree with their opinion. Maybe I did agree with their opinion, but I really thought going to the people who were right there, who live with whatever it is as the part of their daily lives, was very interesting to explore. And again, from a journalistic point of view, with no, you know, you weren't trying to frame it in one way or another. You were simply saying, this is what these people think. So that part of the book I also really enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all the feedback. I'm blushing now.
Well, and that's what it means a lot to us that, you know, we're not Good Morning America, but it means a lot to us that you took the time to
It's a much
talk
better
to us.
crowd, I think, yeah, than Good Morning America.
Well, and I just want to end with the question that a lot of people have asked. I mean, what would your advice, Gloria, be to a group like ours? People who care about bears, people who I think maybe started by caring primarily about brown bears, but now we have this broader vision, right, of bears in the world. So Gloria, what advice would you give to people like us? What can we do, you know, to demonstrate that we care about bears?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a hard question, I think, like, you know, within the kind of political context that you can work in your own areas where you live, like the, you know, legislators in terms of more of the regressive wildlife laws that we've seen, depending on where people live, right? Like pushing back against those, supporting politicians speaking against those, making your voice heard in that way. I mean, influencing policy is always one of the most important things I think that people can do, right? But depending on I mean, it can be difficult too, right? Depending on what happens with elections. But I think in terms of the international bears, you know, yeah, telling friends in a way, right? Like to making them aware, sharing bear facts, I think makes other people. I've gotten a lot of responses from people saying that they love to share all the bear facts now about sun bears, about moon bears, just like increasing that like awareness of these other species. I love the idea of trying to help support the scientists who are doing some of this work too. And I'll look up links because there are some, I think there are some Ecuadorian kind of scientific NGOs doing that work too, and I'll share those with you tomorrow probably because it's later here. But supporting those sorts of efforts as well. But yeah, I mean, some of the challenges are quite big. I mean, I personally, yeah, I donate to Animals Asia quite a lot, just because I'm so heartened by all they've done for the bio. I mean, the bio bear story for me was probably the most impactful. I still feel very sad about it a lot when I think of those bears. But yeah, I mean, there's other, yeah, sun bear. I mean, there's so many worthy causes with bears, right? So it's hard to know what to choose. Yeah.
Well, oh, go ahead.
Spreading the word and influencing politicians. That's yeah.
Here to both of those. It is 4:24 here in Massachusetts, which I think means it's almost 8:30 in London. So thank you, Gloria, for spending your Saturday night with us. Thank you for spending World Bear Day with us.
It was a very special World Bear Day. I will remember it fondly. And thank you everyone for all your lovely questions. I was really impressed by like the breadth and thoughtfulness of your questions tonight. I've done like quite a few kind of events over the past year, and this was definitely like top notch in terms of your reflections. Yeah, I can show that you really care about bears, and it's nice to hear about like the other books that you've read and how they've informed you too. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. What a great way to spend a Saturday night. We will meet next week to talk about the grizzly bear chapter. Gloria will not be with us. We're on our own for that one. But thanks, everybody. Happy Bear Day, and we'll see you in a week. Bye.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria.
Thank you.